Hello, everyone. We have a smaller audience this morning, but hopefully the session will fill up. As it is the third session of the Meet the Researchers at this year's Beyond Conference, we have 5 presentations for you. So without further ado, let's start with the first one, which is titled "Augmented Reality Headsets for Emplaced Storytelling" by Rob Eagle from the University of West of England, Bristol. Rob.
Thank you. Yeah, seeing as we're a small group, I thought we could have a little bit of fun. I'm going to keep my presentation. It's not very theoretical and it's not very technical because I'm doing a practice as research PhD, so practice-based research PhD. So let me just share my window here. So here's a photo of me posing in my installation. It's called Through the Wardrobe. And this is my main output of my practice-based research. So I'll be talking a little bit about the headset that I was using, the HoloLens, and what it gave me for storytelling in particular. So what do I mean by an AR headset? There are a couple on the market that I'm sure people will know. I use the HoloLens, but I'm sort of technology device agnostic, more or less. There's also, and then there's a whole wave of AR glasses that are coming out onto the market. And these, whilst they might give you some sort of objects on the world, they're not quite as environment aware. So the main reason why I'm using a headset over glasses is that it has more inside out tracking and it has more sort of environment recognition. So what do I mean by emplacement? So a lot of people who are involved with working in virtual reality talk about embodiment. And I'm kind of adapting the idea of emplacement from David Howes, who's an anthropologist, where he says embodiment is really looking at the mind-body relationship, whereas emplacement is thinking of the mind-body relationship in relationship to the environment. So it's more a trio. And it's thinking about our bodies and our minds as impacted and as impacting the space around it. And so I think space is absolutely essential when thinking about these immersive technologies, but I think also when I'm looking at an AR headset, the fact that you still see your environment, you still see your body through it. So you're much more aware of your environment. So that's why I'm saying emplaced as opposed to embodied. So here is the lovely graphic for my project Through the Wardrobe. It premiered last year at Sheffield Dockfest. It then went on to tour, went to Amsterdam. And so I'll be showing you a few of the photos from that. But briefly, what the project is. Here it is in Amsterdam. A person, a visitor will come into the space and they will be able to select an item of clothing. So you see all the clothing there in that shop there in Central Station in Amsterdam. So the visitor will come in, choose an item of clothing, and every item of clothing has a tag. They put on the item of clothing and then they put on the HoloLens. The HoloLens then scans the tag and it launches the story. So you have 4 different stories, 4 different characters that you can go into. Each one of them is genderqueer or non-binary, and they're going to give you a bit of an explanation around the clothing that they wear and kind of take you through a bit of their daily life and a bit of their world and what clothing means to them. The visitor experiences this within a set of a bedroom. So here's my friend's husband, you can see in that photo, wearing the HoloLens in the bedroom. There's a bed, there's a chest of drawers, there's a table, there's a chair, and there's a lamp. So those are the stations. And as you approach each of these items, a new part of the story appears in front of you. These are some views of it from home in Manchester. We intentionally wanted to make a work that could evolve, that could adapt to different spaces. So that's how it looks in a gallery, in an actual proper art gallery. And then this was just last week in Beijing at the Goethe Institute, China. So we had a space down there, again, with kind of quite controlled lighting, like an art gallery. And we adapted this to a local Chinese audience. So we had everything translated and used local furniture. The only thing that we took over was all the clothing. So the clothing and the jewelry has all remained the same. So through working on this, with practice-based research, you have this interesting interplay in your praxis of theory and practice, of course. And so I think one of the things that's really emerged in this is that I started from reading lots of theory, and particularly from geography and phenomenology, and particularly from geography, I started to see this term third space, which started from Edward Soja. And he talks about this trilectic relationship that we have in the environment. So I've sort of adapted that. If you want to see more of that, it's in the actual poster that's been uploaded. So I've used this idea of a trilectic of space with a bit of phenomenology. And in particular with Through the Wardrobe, what we see is this sort of back and forth, this interplay between our visitor who comes in and the way that they interact with the set, the way the set is fully interactable, just as if it were a bedroom. The way that the technology, the device, the HoloLens itself actually responds to the set, and the way that it responds to the person. So it's more than just a person kind of coming into a space and passively seeing something projected. They're actually actively working with both the physical environment and the device. So of course that presents quite a few challenges for me. I used a lot of the ideas around this also to work with dancers. So this was a project that came just after this called Moving Layers, which was supported by Cluster. So we're using a lot of the same sort of idea of the body. In this case, we were putting the headset on both the dancers and the audience with this sense of environment. So keeping in mind that sort of trilectic. So what's come out of this? Out of 3 years of working on Through the Wardrobe and then coming to Moving Layers, I've come up with a number of insights, I would say, into the theory that essentially I didn't have before. So this is sort of a list of the findings and the recommendations that I sort of wish that I had 3 years ago when I embarked on this research. So first of all, it would be to look at emplacement, not just embodiment, this trilectic of the body, the technology, and the way that that works in space. Because once you understand that it's not just about a linear or flat technology, and you understand how it works in space, that sort of unlocks a lot of your potential for the storytelling, because that's what this is about. I'm using these headsets not just to sell you something or just for a novelty, but for actually guiding you along within a story. In terms of general design challenges, there are a number for these types of headsets. And I think one of them is spatial audio. So when you, with so much AR out there, I'm seeing a lot of, in particular, just stereo. So thinking more about space and placing your audio in the corners of the room, essentially. So as people go through the experience, they're unlocking different parts of audio around the room. Learning from architecture and sculpture. I mean, these are inherently spatial, three-dimensional media. And I think it's something valuable for people like me who came from film, from traditional linear and flat media, to think more about how do architects express emotions in a space? How does a sculptor tell a story through an object? And so I use this idea of sculpture in the 3D objects within the headset. Harnessing multisensory stimuli. So reducing the emphasis just on visuals and really thinking about sense of smell, the touch, just the natural haptic feedback you get from touching a bed or from opening a chest of drawers. Using object recognition and spatial or gaze commands for interaction design. So thinking not just of the body as a controller, but thinking about how your body reacts to spaces, but then how the headset itself can recognize, say, the tag, or can remember where the bed is. So I'm using that a lot in order to guide guide the visitor through. Ironic on a page full of text, but I also learned the importance of minimal text. When you are onboarding your visitors and they see loads of instructions on the screen and they're hearing it, it gets quite overwhelming. So trying to do a lot of user testing so that you can understand what is the minimal text that you can possibly have on screen. I also started to move away from volumetric capture, so I don't use any volumetric capture because you start to get problems with poly count. So embracing abstract and lo-fi visuals. I think this also unlocks a lot for the storytelling. If you can give your audience something more that's abstract, it allows them to project their imagination onto it a bit more. So we embrace that in Through the Wardrobe. Applying these methods from radio and immersive theater, of course, for your story worlds rather than from film, and then incorporating socially marginalized voices into this. So we had people on board as part of this, who were part of the production, who were all part of the queer and non-binary community. And finally, incorporating user feedback as you go along. So from the very beginning, and thinking of design justice. So here's a recommendation. This is also available on the poster. So that's me. If you want to follow up with some of those links, they're on the poster. This is my Twitter handle, and that's the Twitter handle for the project.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Rob, for a great presentation. Next up, we have Emily Godden, who will be presenting on hacking environmental heritage with homebrew technologies and open source data to reclaim the lost city. Your turn.
Hello, so I'm going to be talking to you today about part of my PhD research, and this is just a segment of the poster, PhD research. That's hacking environmental heritage with homebrew technologies and open source data to reclaim the lost city. So what is the lost city? Dunwich is a small village on the Suffolk coast being absorbed by the North Sea, and it's commonly referred to as the Lost City. Most of it is underwater, and if you give it a quick look in your preferred search engine of choice, it will be often referenced as this kind of Atlantis. Most of it's kind of gone. So and most of its heritage is also kind of built on that idea of loss. So I'm interested in building site-specific interactive narratives that have tangible with an asterisk during COVID, interfaces using multimodal storytelling, so working across different kind of modes, some XR environments, some kind of lower technologies such as board games, spoken word poetry, in order to look at and create kind of more meaningful, engaging ontological relationships with our environment. And on the right here, you can see this is a GIF. It's going through an image of one of the churches. There is one remaining church above sea level in Dunwich, and this was the most recent to sort of disappear and fall off. And if you can see, the numbers are kind of tiny. It's from 1880 to up to 1920. The rapid progression. Dunwich is being lost on an average about 1 metre per year. So the question I'm addressing with this poster, looking at is heritage hacks, working with people, place, and zombie media to reclaim the lost city. Full disclosure, what I mean by zombie media is a term from Yusuf Farika and Garnet Hertz that looks at how obsolete media refuse to disappear from planetary existence. So no zombies, I'm afraid, as yet, but you never know what the future may hold. So I'm looking at how can technologies from the past be used to hack stories from Dunwich's heritage, lost in the North Sea, to be relevant today. Now the word hacked or hacked, it definitely put a chill down the spine of my supervisor. I'm not doing anything slightly dodgy, iffy or illegal here. I'm looking at how I can repurpose and recycle and use existing technologies. So this image on the right here, this is a 12th century iron hook that's from the collection in Dunwich Museum. And when I saw this in a cheeky museum visit in between lockdowns, I immediately thought that looks like it could be really handy for entering your PIN on a chip and PIN machine. So I created a 3D model of this in 3ds Max and then printed this and then sort of used that in the real world. I'm interested in how site-specific interactive narratives that I'm particularly interested in branching narratives and giving the user agency and choice, how they can affect our ontological relationship with our environment. So I'm very much interested in user experience design and the theory that comes from there. So by hacking technologies, I'm looking at how I can reduce the resources used and explore media archaeologies. And we're all kind of often guilty with this, particularly in the immersive media kind of sector, as to the rate and the speed of which we iterate and use different kind of hardware. So I'm interested and be interested in to know how many people have got technologies that are gathering dust, whether that's the sort of classic, and we all know the Nokia 3310, how amazing that was. If you've got it in your drawer, it's probably still got a bit of battery if you turn it on, through to the HoloLens V1 or a DK1 Oculus headset, how quickly we enter and go through these different pieces of hardware. Because I'm interested in our relationship with our environment, it kind of felt a little bit hypocritical to be looking and working with the bleeding edge of technology when e-waste is such a polluter. So this image here, we've all kind of, a lot of us will be familiar with it. This is a Cat5 Ethernet cable rescued from a post office. Yes, there was a post office in Suffolk still using, we don't have the best broadband in Suffolk, I'm afraid, still relying on this lovely Cat5 wire. A lot of us have used these lately during lockdown, given the amount of traffic we've got, to repurpose that and use that as a means to send a signal. So I'm looking at how I can use technologies that are already there, and if anyone has any technologies gathering dust they'd like to donate to a worthy cause, I'd happily dissect and hack them in which to use them. So like most people, I've had to adapt and look at what I can access remotely during lockdown. And QGIS is a wonderful piece of software for mapping. A lot of archaeologists typically use this. And also the Environment Agency National LiDAR program. This data is open access, so if you want to go and have a little look and see if you're on there, where you are in, this is England, Wales, Northern Ireland. Scotland has their own database. I can map and look at how much of Dunwich has disappeared through to the I think 1990s, the oldest data they have. So I'm focusing on lost heritage rather than Holtorf's definition of loss aversion. As much as I'd love to protect the physical remains, I'm just not physically able to do it. But what I can do is use stories to bring back and hold on to that lost heritage that's underwater and bring it back to life on terra firma. So the UK is the second on the planet, second highest polluter of electronic waste on the planet, and there's 50 million tonnes of electronic waste generated every year. So there's a clear need for us to be working with fewer and more sustainable resources. And in Blue Peter style, here is the homebrew LiDAR. Never underestimate the influence of children's TV. I was born in the 90s. That's a strong influence of raiding the kitchen cupboard for what I could access and use during lockdown. We've heard quite a lot during this conference about how expensive and costly, not just financially, but to the environment that these technologies can be. And as a maker, I have access to things such as an Arduino Nano. This is a £4 device, the brain that's powering this homemade LiDAR scanner. It has a list of its ingredients that are powering this. This is a LiDAR light version 2. There are other versions available, scanner that's powering this device here. So it's all kind of low-tech in order to create a high-tech experience. So I've gone through that very, very quickly. Trust me, I'm probably more scared of you than you are of me, so please do get in touch. I'm on Twitter, and also do email me. This to me in my natural habitat should we not be in the weird world that we live in right now. I'd love to hear from you, and if you have any abandoned tech you'd like to give to a good cause, do get in touch. But thank you very much for having me Beyond Conference, and it's wonderful to hear other PhD students.
Thank you very much, Emily. So we'll know to send you our old cables and old Ethernet bundles to reuse. Thank you. So next up we have Catherine Taylor from the University of Bath and also Marshmallow Laser Feast. And she'll be presenting on Deforming Reality, exploring the boundary between physical and virtual using deep learning. Catherine, your turn.
Hi, I'm Catherine. I'm a final year NG student at the University of Bath, and I'm also working on my research with Marshmallow Laser Feast. Today I'm going to be talking about part of my thesis, which we've titled Deforming Reality, Exploring the Boundary Between Physical and Virtual Using Deep Learning. Through my research, we've been asking the question, how do we bridge the gap between physical and virtual? Immersive VR and AR experiences allow participants to explore fantastical virtual worlds, which would otherwise be impossible. And this has a lot of applications for creating engaging immersive performances and art exhibitions. But as well as that, in a year when COVID has meant there's been so many restrictions on what we can and can't do, having a way of transporting yourself from your own home to somewhere new is really exciting. One thing we found that really affects immersion is the manner in which participants are able to interact with the virtual world. So we try to, in our research, make the physical world a larger part of the virtual by transporting real-world objects into the physical environment. And to do this, we need to track and reconstruct the behaviour of the physical objects. In particular, we're interested in non-rigid objects, as we can create innovative and exciting experiences with these soft, squishy objects that are very different from all the traditional VR interactions. So how do we transport physical objects into virtual environments? Traditionally, controllers have been used as a means of interaction, with a sequence of button presses corresponding to particular action of the virtual environment or objects in that scene. However, controllers are quite limiting. Firstly, they offer minimal tactile feedback. So if you try and hit an object in the scene, your controller might vibrate in response to that. But apart from that, there's not very much. And as well as this, they don't model the natural way of interacting with a physical object, causing quite a lot of disconnect between the real and the virtual. These interactions are very cold and hard. External sensors such as the Vive tracker, shown here attached to some sports props, track the 3D position and orientation of the marker. And these can be attached to the surface of an object and used in turn to drive a virtual avatar. However, these only capture rigid motions. And as well as that, they're quite large attachments. So when you place them on your object, if it's a small handheld object, it's likely that's going to restrict its motion. And as well as that, it's going to change the weight and shape, which is going to detract from the immersion. On the other hand, motion capture systems are able to track a sparse number of markers on the surface of an object in order to drive a non-rigid rigged model or track a rigid object. And for some setups, motion capture system is an ideal solution for this. For a large-scale location-based experience, complex non-rigid deformations can be captured and tracked over a wide area. But for a small in-home, for example, experience, motion capture systems are just not practical. They involve costly non-standard hardware and require a lot of space. And as well as this, motion capture systems are quite sensitive to marker occlusion. So if you're interacting with your physical object and you're playing with it and twisting it around in your hands, you're likely to be covering up some of the markers, and so the deformations tracked are going to decrease in accuracy. So in my research, I've been interested in looking at deep learning solutions. Neural networks have shown potential for object tracking, not just recovering the 6-degree of freedom pose of a rigid object, but also being able to capture non-rigid deformations. And this whole work by Cáceres et al. Shows that networks are able to reconstruct the shape and pose of a human body even from a single RGB image. In particular as well, we're interested in networks which are able to track objects from a first-person view. Like I mentioned, motion capture systems aren't an ideal solution for an in-home experience or setup, but we still want to be able to have that flexibility and freedom that you really get with VR. And if we have a fixed camera approach, then the object can only be tracked in that predefined capture volume. But with a moving camera, for example, a sensor attached to a VR head-mounted device, the object can be tracked in a first-person perspective and we maintain that flexibility. So this is just a brief overview of our pipeline. Firstly, we create a synthetic data set in Unity. We want to use a synthetic data set for network training, as we can quickly and easily generate a large amount of data without requiring a slow manual capture process. We create a computer-generated model representation of our object, We can either do this by 3D scanning the object or using photogrammetry or manually sculpting. And then from that, we create a blend shape model. This can again be done automatically or manually, depending on what deformations you would like to model. We then randomly deform it. So we vary its 3D position and rotate it around its centroid and bend it by varying the blend shape weights. This gives us a lot of images with different deformations and different positions in 3D space. We render these, and we want to make sure that the synthetic rendered images are as close as possible to the real-world images, which we will test on at runtime. And so we set the virtual camera parameters equal to the real camera parameters. And despite this, there's still quite a lot of differences between the two data sets. So we do an image pre-processing to try and minimize that difference further. We take our input image and we build up a Gaussian mixture model for each section of the object we want to be tracked. And this is just a color distribution. So then we test each pixel, and if it falls within this color distribution, then it belongs to the object, and that's great. And if it doesn't, then it's background and we remove it. So this segments the object. We then take all pixels which fall within the same distribution. This is color, pixels which are the same color, but maybe a slightly different shade. And we flatten these. And this flattening removes any lighting variations. Finally, we crop our image. Using the pre-processed images, we're ready to train a network to predict the model parameters. The network takes in the processed image and returns deformation parameters, which are how much it's been translated, how much it's been rotated, and any of the blend shape information. And using these, we can update the computer-generated model ready to be rendered into our virtual environment. The final step of the pipeline is making sure everything is correctly aligned. We have so many different pieces of technology resulting in lots of different coordinate systems. So we have the VR system coordinate system, the camera system, and then the world coordinate system, which depends on the physical environment. We want to make sure these are all correctly aligned so that when you reach out and you try and touch the physical object, the virtual object is in the correct place. So to do this, we just do several coordinate transforms and move everything into one unified world coordinate system. We tested our pipeline on a range of different rigid and non-rigid objects, and we've got promising results. In these videos, we have textured the virtual objects with the same texture as a real object. In VR or AR, these can be augmented and visual effects added or stylized textures according to the experience. As well as it's just really fun and exciting to play with. There's something really novel about being able to reach out in VR and not have your hands go through the object, and instead you get this tactile feedback. It's especially fun with the soft, squishy objects. Being able to bend an object and have your virtual object react accordingly is really exciting. So to conclude, we've used physical objects to create tactile VR and AR experiences. And with deformable objects, we can create impactful, innovative interactions. There's lots of applications for such technology. Firstly, we see it for in-home setups, with just adding that extra level of engagement, a new way of interacting with the virtual world. And as well as this, we'd like to look at combining the technology with other inputs such as motion capture systems and sensors in a large-scale location-based experiences to create these really exciting and novel interaction experiences. Thank you for listening to our presentation today, and I've included my contact details if you'd like to get in touch further. And my poster has more images and results of the technologies. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, for a fascinating presentation. Thank you for joining us. Without any delay, we're going to John, Álvaro, and Andrew from the Digital Creativity Labs at the University of York. They will be talking about the cutting room and object-based media anthology authoring tool, for non-technical users. There's 3 presenters, so I think that there will be some kind of juggle between the 3 of them in their presentation. But in any case, guys, stage is yours.
My name is Andrew Walter. My colleague joining me today is Álvaro Cáceres. John Gray will be joining us a little bit later. As said, we are from the Digital Creativity Labs at the University of York, which is an interdisciplinary centre for research into games, interactive media, and anything that can be sort of related to the concept of digital creativity. We have over 30 researchers and hundreds of partners organizations working with us, including people like the BBC, various games companies, and our researchers are working on things as diverse as language education games, public perceptions of artificial intelligence, and esports analytics visualization. As for what we're going to be talking about today, Cutting Room is a tool that allows non-technical users to author complex, interactive, non-linear audiovisual experiences via the application of the object-based media model. So first of all, we're going to explain what on earth does that mean. We'll look at some previous work in the field of object-based media. We'll then be talking obviously about Cutting Room itself, some projects that have already happened at DC Labs using Cutting Room, and then what's going to happen next with our work. So first of all, what is object-based media, which is the sort of idea at the heart of Cutting Room? It's a term that was coined by BBC R&D in 2003, and it refers to a methodology of creating interactive content. In their case, they were concerned with interactive television broadcasts. As it stood previously, the way in which interactive broadcasts were created is that multiple different streams would be created and then delivered to the viewer, who would then select between them. So if you wanted to broadcast a sort of complex interactive narrative, you'd need to create every conceivable iteration of that narrative, and then the viewer would choose between the different strands they were on as they interacted with it. Object-based media, on the other hand, puts together its broadcast, so to speak, at broadcast time based on interactions from the viewer, and it does this based on some form of constructed logic, which it uses to choose from a library of media that has been set aside for the broadcast. So to return to the analogy, with a large branching narrative, each sort of individual fragment of that narrative would be sitting ready to go, and then the one that was required would then be broadcast. So one of the earliest examples of this was something called shape-shifting TV, which was developed in the early 2000s as part of a project called New Media for a New Millennium. It focused on interactive television, and in particular, the demonstration broadcast was a program called Accidental Lovers that was made in collaboration with the Finnish national broadcaster in 2006. It was a complex, non-linear, branching narrative, perhaps comparable to some stuff that Netflix has been making in more recent years, but using on terrestrial broadcast television. It had some shortcomings, namely that the way in which narratives were written, so to speak, was using a markup language, a scripting language called narrative structure language, which obviously the creator would have to become familiar with in order to use. And it also required a dedicated set-top box in order to work. Despite that, Accidental Lovers was very well received, and the technology of object-based media has gone on to be used. So I'm just going to pass over to my colleague Álvaro, who's going to talk a little bit more about the particular implementation of OBM that we use. Álvaro, are you there?
Yeah. Sorry, it's loading. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, I'm going to talk about the OBM model that we are using in these different iterations of similar software. Basically, the implementation that we are using for Cutting Room is using 3 different kinds of narrative objects. We've got atomic narrative objects, which are used to store media like video, audio, or any other kind of media you can think of. Layered narrative objects, which basically allow you to display multiple pieces of media simultaneously. And groups, which allow you to play content sequentially according to some criteria. Also, for these three kinds of narrative objects, we have some sort of logic system that allows us to decide how the narrative is going to branch in different directions, depending on user choices, and also from depending on, for instance, data coming from external sources. So for an atomic narrative objects, we can say which is the next narrative object that is going to be played or sequenced once the current one is finished. For layers, we can do the same thing, but we can also decide which layers are going to be shown. And for groups, apart from deciding which is the next narrative object that is going to be sequenced, we can also decide which objects in our group should be shown and when to stop picking objects. And we have criteria for all these kinds of settings. Also, we can add variables and tags to our system, which are incredibly useful because they allow us to extend our model with data that can be manipulated on the fly as the user, or rather the viewer, is playing our piece of media. So here you can see an example of an atomic narrative object which contains some metadata tags. Metadata tags can accept any kind of title and any kind of content, and we can also restrict the kind of content included for some particular tags. So for instance, for time, we could restrict that particular tag to morning, midday, and evening, for instance. And here we've got an example of a variable, of different variables that are stored in an abstraction we call the variable store. And again, variables can be of different types, which restrict the kind of content that we can store, namely strings, numbers, and also within those types, we can restrict the kind of values we are going to have for those variables, which is all done in our cutting room user interface. And now I'm again giving the presentation to Andrew to talk about the first iteration of cutting room.
Hello again. So yes, so the first version of Cutting Room developed was in 2018 by Digital Creativity Labs, directly working with BBC R&D. And the focus was on creating something that could be used much more easily, that was much more streamlined than the old shapeshifting media interface. It was a web application. It was based on JavaScript, and its sort of flagship presentation was a film called What is Love, which was exhibited at the York Mediale Arts Festival in 2018. The shortcomings of this first iteration of Cutting Room were that while it was much easier to use, it necessitated a loss of some of the expressive power of the object-based model. In particular, some of the abilities of metadata tagging and the variable system were somewhat lost. So to re-implement that expressive power, the decision was made to transfer the Cutting Room project over to using the game engine Unity. That meant that we could take advantage of all Unity's various pre-existing functionality, like its rendering systems and its extensive scripting ability to implement Cutting Room. And also that meant that users could write their own Unity scripts if Cutting Room couldn't do something that they wanted it to do. The shortcoming, of course, of this then is that Unity, being a game engine, is much more optimized for a different kind of user, someone with a much more technical perspective than the sort of more creative focused individuals we were hoping would use Cutting Room. Yes. So a case in point to illustrate that was a project that was also at this conference, coincidentally, called Stepping Through, which is developed by a doctoral student at the university called Simona Mani. It was a collaborative, participatory filmmaking project about mental health, working with members of the Converge mental health program in York. It was designed by Simona and her participants, but then implemented by myself and John Gray as engineers at DC Labs, because Simona did not have the necessary technical skills to use Unity, and it wasn't practical for her to master the Unity game engine in order to create an interactive film. However, as you'll note from the illustration on the right-hand side of the screen, it was a much more complex narrative than is typically seen in more straightforward branching narratives, taking full advantage of our various groups and layering systems and our ability to do more complex reasoning. So we then shifted to developing a version that had a much more user-friendly front end, and I shall now pass over to Álvaro, who was our lead UI developer, and who is able there to speak to that.
Yes, so basically for the second version of Cutting Room, we were coming from something we had already working in Unity, which allows us to, by the way, I'm not sure if you can see my screen. Like I was saying, Unity gave us the flexibility and power and the user community to build new narratives using the system. However, it's quite complex, as we mentioned before. It contains many options, and it can be complicated for new users to get used to it. So what I tried to do in this case, what we tried to do with the second iteration of Cutting Room, was to make it simple, to restrict the amount of options available to the user, to make it consistent so that everything we change is also changed in other parts of the editor, to make it secure so that we minimize the amount of errors that the user can make, which is something that can happen easily if we use the Unity default inspector user interface, and try to make it as accessible as possible. Here you can see a small screenshot of the narrative space editor, when we can represent atomic narrative nodes and other narrative objects connected, shown as nodes connected with arrows, which is quite an intuitive and universal representation. For this, I drew inspiration from the Unity UI itself and trying to make it consistent with that. I also drew inspiration from video editing software, like for instance, Adobe Premiere. And to some extent, I also grabbed some ideas from material design to sort of make the user interface more familiar to new users who may be more used to mobile technologies. Here you can see another example of a property inspector for our narrative. In order to develop this, I started wireframing the main UI using Google Drawings in the beginning, then switching to Figma. I've been working on the layout and UI states of the user interface using something called immediate mode GUI, which is the Unity system that allows us to extend the user interface of the editor, and UI elements for basically styling our user interface. And you can see here examples of the UI using all these custom UI states and styling. First, we understood quite well what the user requirements were and what were the previous iterations of Cutting Room. We switched then to a design specification, writing a design doc. Then BTGester helped us to develop the software in the first instance. And right now we're in the process of testing and documentation. Some conclusion that we can get from this is that Unity poses some limitations in terms of detail and animation system and accessibility, where only 2 tooltips are allowed to be displayed. Also some limitations in the scripting system that we are using. We are looking forward to use more modern tools that will be available in the future, like UI Toolkit and UI Builder. Also, in the future,
we might want to skip this to the end, as it looks like, unfortunately, we've already overrun by 5 minutes. So we
okay, sure.
Yes.
Basically, that's all for us. We are in the last stages of our project, and if you have any doubts about it, feel free to contact us. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Álvaro. And now wrapping up this session will be Sabine from the University of Chester. She will be talking to us about how can embodied drawing practices negotiate the relationship between self, body, and natural environments. Thank you, Sabine, for joining us.
Hello, and thank you for inviting me. I think my presentation is as analog as things can be. Right, so I'm from the University of Chester, and this is a part-time PhD in the visual arts. I'm a visual artist. I'm a person who draws originally, and a fashion designer in the very origin of things. And I'm exploring in the widest possible sense how drawing practices, meaning using line and using installation, can negotiate the relationships between ourselves and outdoor environments. So art making is used as an interface, or as a mode to stage and manage our engagements with ourselves, with the materials that we encounter outdoors, and with the spaces where this art making happens. So it's a quite constructivist approach. I use a mobile working kit, or what I call a mobile working kit. It's materials that have a modular quality that I make in the studio, made from paper and wood. And I carry them, I bundle them, and have sort of transportation ways of going about with them into natural open environments, where I then make installations or where I draw. And then I bring these things back into art exhibition spaces, where I make what I call composite artworks, because they contain artifacts from the site, materials that are documentation materials like video clips, and all of this assembled as a site installation. And also, I also consider like videos that I make as composite artworks. So my methodology really means that I'm aiming to stage encounters between myself, the environment, and the mobile working kit. Quite what I think Rob does in a way as well with his, but different in his first presentation. The emphasis is on affective encounters. I'm also using running and walking to journey through the places where I have my art making activities. So I use the mobile working kit, but I also make drawings and installations with them. I make a lot of I document myself a lot, like I video myself, I take photographs, and I make drawings of the art making event, and then everything is being assembled to make these composite artworks. The focus of this project is to focus on my own subjective experience of the art making event. So art making is seen in a temporal context, like from one event to the next. And this focus on my own personal experience of the art making and the temporal concept of it has to do with working with vast outdoor environments. Because they are so big and they are continuously changing, there needs to be some kind of focus that offers a bit of a certain degree of stability. So the person who is going backwards and forwards, and the same person again, and their experience kind of guarantees that. The narrative of the practice is that I'm actually showing to audiences how the art making happens to me in a very embodied, very physical kind of sense, and how it happens to the material that are with me there. The most important methodological concept that is behind of this is that I'm understanding the dynamic between materials from a new materialist point of view. So Karen Barad and others' writing is quite important. Karen Barad says that when materials and things interact with each other, she uses the term interaction, then only then in that process do materials become separated into different bodies and into different processes. So this is quite a relevant and deep and profound thing when it comes to making sculpture, making drawings, and differentiating between what is performance, what is drawing, what is sculpture, what is dance, what is farming, what are the different activities. And in the process of interaction, marks are left on bodies. So marks on bodies is also a very humble term to describe sculpture making or making drawings. And so these are the kind of environments in the Peak District in the northwest of England where I'm working at the moment. This was a kind of installation with lines that I did 2 years ago. The mobile working kit is made out of paper rolls, some found objects, but also mainly sticks. And then I also developed storage and mobile devices to make these things go with me on sites, but also to facilitate installations in a gallery environment. When I make outdoor installations or drawings, I just take these materials and I respond to the possibilities that the mobile working kit offers with this set or matrix of environmental conditions. And the environment is immensely unpredictable. And then I take these installations or drawings down again, and I use photographs and videos that I have made to process them further. I have quite a meticulous system of documenting my art making activities, and I don't only catalogue everything in a very temporal terms quite meticulously and make books out of these, out of the documentation. I also use drawing to analyze or to reflect back at past events, but also to plan further events and make diagrams about interactions that are going on. What I call the composite artworks, the installations, they have what's important about them is that they have a tension between the artifacts that have come back from the sites, which are quite often dirty, ripped, and bear the marks of having been somewhere very different from the gallery space, and what actually goes on in the gallery space. When I make videos, I assemble documentary video clips together into rhythms of themselves and into layers of themselves. And I think this is quite an interesting process to work with. My results, I would say, I'm in the second year, so and this has gone around for quite some time. I'm finding that self is constructed or experienced in a quite interesting way in outdoor environments. The outdoor environments impact on the relationships that we have between how we experience our internal selves and the exteroceptive events that are going on. And what regards art making strategies, I find that the layering and the rhythmic arrangement of artifacts found or used on site or video clips or documentation elements, that they can reveal attractions and resistances between things before we actually apply these frameworks like this is dance, this is drawing, this is installation to them. And I think that's a very interesting thing that I need to explore further. And that's the end of the presentation.
Thank you very much. Fantastic. If all of our presenters just briefly pop up on screen again, I can see Rob coming out, Emily's coming up, Andrew is coming up, Catherine, Fantastic. Great. So we don't have a lot of time for a Q&A, but I was just going to pose a quick question to all of you, and I see that Emily's already started engaging about how you actually choose your objects or your environment to engage with. So, for example, Rob, why is it a wardrobe? Why is it a kitchen?
Well, I mean, the wardrobe is virtual, but the clothing is all physical, and it's using the clothing and the physical bedroom as a way also to project not just the AR, but to project imagination. So I'm bringing my visitors into the space so that they can project through seeing the marks on these fabrics and seeing that it's been used. And it's really interesting to see what Sabine is doing with materials as well, and embracing the dirt. The way that becomes there's a very powerful interplay for visitors between that physical and the digital combined. So that's why I use those physical objects with the virtual.
Mm-hmm. Fab. And what about the rest? How do you actually decide on what type of object? What is the motivation, and why do you think that you're driven to use digital technology and digital tools? How does the digital change your interaction with these objects? Emily, I think
I use digital as a means to sort of like give them the object a kind of new life, to extend its initial use. And I think that's what's really interesting about maker and hacker kind of culture, is it's kind of very much like looking at things from a different perspective and seeing what you can do differently. Hopefully to create, to quote Brenda from this morning, that create a better verse.
Okay, fabulous. I feel like this session specifically had this running theme of trying to engage, re-engage, rejuvenate with your environment, with the natural environment, with an object somewhat differently. I see Sabine nodding. She's listening. I'm afraid we're sort of running out of time at this point. But what I would suggest is that for our audience to go and visit the posters on the website and reach out to all of you. And you've very kindly provided your social media sort of coordinates and emails. So maybe, Emily, we can have some more cables for you, hopefully. And in the meantime, thank you very much for taking the time. Thank you for your fantastic contributions to the poster exhibition and to beyond. Please feel free to roam around the virtual spaces, and there's 2 stages today. There's the main stage and the Creative China stage. So feel free to check that out. And yeah, once again, thank you very much for joining us. You've been amazing. Virtual applause. Bye.